Welcome to Engineered for Impact, a podcast helping engineers learn and think more about how they can have a positive social impact with their careers. In today's episode, I talked to Soroush Pour about how he approaches career change. Soroush is an engineer and entrepreneur who is currently on sabbatical from his role as head of special projects at VAL. We discussed the psychology and methods that he employed in a year-long period of independent research in which he changed from the world of fintech to the world of cultivated meats. We cover the practical things that he found particularly valuable during this period of independent research, the role of engineers in cultivated meat, and how he's approaching his current sabbatical where he's investigating the safe and beneficial development of artificial general intelligence. You'll find the show notes with links to learn more and ways to support the podcast at engineeredforimpact.show/Soroush. That's SOROUSH. So, without further ado, here's Soroush.
My name is Soroush, and I'm an engineer and an entrepreneur, and I've been working in the technology space for about 10 or so years now. So I went to university. I grew up here in Sydney, Australia, went to university in the United States at Duke University in North Carolina, did my first startup in Berlin, and that was a little bit of an accident. I kind of fell into that startup, but I really loved the experience of seeing a problem in the world and going out there and just building it and seeing if what you built was useful, rather than kind of playing the game of earning your stripes for a long time at a large company or academia or something like that. So while that company was only a modest success, it was a really exciting opportunity, and it really made me fall in love with startups. So from then on, I have worked in startups my whole career, either as a founder, as an early engineer, manager, board director, investor, advisor, all kinds of things. Some of the most formative and interesting experiences I've had, I worked in San Francisco for a company called Plaid, which when I joined was a small software financial technology company and grew to be a more than $20 billion valued, over 1,000-person API technology company that provided financial infrastructure in San Francisco. More recently, I worked at VAL, which VAL is a cell-cultured meat company. So we're trying to provide people the meat they love and even actually better meat options, more nutritious and more delicious options, but through a different technology that's less negatively impactful on things like on climate emissions, on land use, on our waterways, and on the ethical challenges of industrial animal agriculture. So I worked there for 3 years as the first engineer, and the person who built out the engineering team and later led the technology team. And then most recently, I can share more about why I've moved into this space, but I've moved into the field of artificial intelligence, particularly motivated by some of the big catastrophic type risks to humanity that I think could be on our horizon as artificial intelligence becomes a lot more capable, what's broadly known as artificial AI alignment. And I can share more of that. But yeah, that's kind of a quick rundown of what I worked on.
Terrific. Yeah, it's a very varied career. When I came across your profile on LinkedIn, I think it was, and saw that you were head of engineering at VAL, head of technology, and head of special projects for the last 3 or 4 years, I thought I just assumed you'd sort of been in the automation sort of space, maybe even the food space for the majority of your career. Then I started looking, sort of scrolling down, and found that you started off in fintech, and you made this jump into the cultured meat or alternate protein space. How did you go about making that jump? I saw that you took about a year to do some independent research. So maybe can you explain sort of how you sort of got to the point of wanting to leave fintech and leave that startup space and then transition into what you've been doing for the last few years.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think there's probably two things worth kind of talking through. One is kind of some of the psychology of this stuff of our identity and role identity, and then the other side is the more practical side of how do you go about doing it. Um, so just quickly on terms of why I did it and why I wanted to make the transition, Plaid was a really incredible company in terms of the quality of people and the really exciting technology we were working on. Um, but I just knew in my heart of hearts that building financial technology wasn't the most inspiring thing I could work on. I think Plaid does good work and I think it continues to do good work, but I felt there were more important problems in the world that had less attention. And since at some point I decided that therefore I wasn't going to find that problem that I really wanted to work on at Plaid, I decided to leave and discover what I would work on next, which turned out to be food sustainability and vow. Um, in terms of, I think it's worth touching on the psychology there a little bit. Even something like to leave a company without another job on the other side is something I think a lot of people get quite scared by. I think we we are taught from a young age that we need to have this really strong identity, and that the way to do that is to kind of earn your stripes and to kind of pay your dues, and then that's like go to high school, go to university, earn the next degree, and earn the next role, and that role will earn you that. And I think those are useful guidelines, right? I think it's important for us to recognize that learning skills and knowledge can make you more impactful in the world, and there are ways to kind of earn those skills. But I think the thing that being exposed to the startup world early in my career taught me was that those are just guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules. Like nobody says that you, or like in a lot of problems in a lot of professions, nobody says you must have A, B, and C before you can do D. If you can just add the valuable thing first, then you should go ahead and do that. So let's say, just as a concrete example, like or like an example that's like it's made up, but I think it's useful. Like for example, if one of us here had the cure to cancer, we don't need to be a PhD in cancer physiology or cancer research to deliver that to the world if we had it. Now, there's obviously the big if of where did you get that, but the point is, it's a good reminder that it's just a guideline that you need to have that PhD. If you can somehow skip the steps, then you should skip the steps, right? It would be almost be a bad thing for you to hold that back from the world. And I think because I knew that, what I often do is I'll decide I want to do something positive in the world and then work backwards as to kind of what's needed and what's not. And I'll challenge a lot of assumptions along the way, my own assumptions, the assumptions of my friends and family, and then of course of broader society and partners as well, like partners that you would work with, collaborators. So going back to be just a bit more concrete, I left Plaid because I didn't think I was going to work in financial technology. I first just started looking at all the things I was interested in and or thought were kind of interesting developments in the world. And I think I just really just spoke to a lot of people. I spoke to friends, family, people in my network about what they're working on. I learned a few skills and things that I wanted to practice to see if that would expose me to something. And I call this whole sort of technique like manufactured serendipity of like put yourself in the right places and then see what you're exposed to, and then you will feel lucky when you find the right thing. And so my lucky moment was I talked to a good friend of mine who worked at a place called the Good Food Institute. They're a not-for-profit that's focused on food sustainability or food system improvement. And I talked to him, and he said you should really look into, some of the challenges of industrial animal agriculture. I think it's a really big field that needs smart people to be working on it. And I asked him a lot of questions. I got his point of view, and then I went off and developed my own. And ultimately I agreed with him that it was a really big thing. For listeners who are just curious about this or don't know too much about what I'm talking about, um, uh, the food system is a massive part of our world, although we don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about it anymore because we, at least in wealthy nations, we have kind of unlimited food. Uh, the food system is the largest user of all the world's land. It's the largest user of the world's freshwater resources. It's a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. It is a huge part of our culture, our geopolitics, food security, all of these things. And specifically within that, the most intensive, resource intensive part of that is industrial animal agriculture. And when you look at it, you'll see there's a lot of issues with it. Issues like uh, climate change and the fact that we have all these climate emissions coming from our food system, most of that coming from animal agriculture. Issues like having billions of sentient animals being used as factory implements and therefore going through a huge amount of suffering. Issues like the majority of the world's antibiotics not actually going to humans and being an issue for antibiotic resistance because of human use, but because of animal use. So I've just scratched the surface of a few dozen that I could come up with now if we wanted to. But once I saw that, I couldn't unsee that. And then I kind of worked backwards as to how do I solve for this. And this sort of thing will depend on your own interests and skills. But for me, as a entrepreneur, I was thinking about, well, how could things be from a product perspective? I don't think I closed myself off to other options, but I knew that products were one of what things I could build and share with the world and sell as products would be the most suitable for me. I did a lot of things in this space, and I'm cognizant of I'm talking for a while, Sean. So stop me anytime. I can keep going. The journey's just getting started. Is this helpful for you?
No, it's definitely helpful. There's a lot to unpack there. Maybe we can like hit pause on that for a second and just sort of unpack a little
Sure,
bit of the,
please.
I guess, the mindset and psychology aspects of making such a drastic shift
Mm,
in what you're working on, and also where you're working as well geographically, and in terms of your employer. So you mentioned there that you really had to challenge some of your own assumptions, or
mm.
you sort of laid all your assumptions bare and challenged, or didn't leave any unchallenged. Were there any particular ones that was sort of like a big aha moment and that you really found were valuable to challenge, or even just to test and find that they actually still hold?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Definitely yes, and I guess I should give people a little bit of the spoiler alert of where the story ends, so that as we talk about it, they're not too confused. Eventually I tried a few different company concepts and was on my way to kind of building a company, but it decided instead to kind of join forces with an existing early stage company called Vow and work on cultured meat. So that's where the story ends. Um, yes, so I mean along the way. I guess the assumption that I had challenged myself a few years before that and kind of carried into this was that in some ways you can learn anything, and I think people forget that. I think people at, let's say, age 18 coming out of high school often feel like they could learn anything and go into any degree, and yet somehow 4 years later they think they've lost that ability. And I think working at a startup where you are forced to learn many skills all the time forces you to realize actually you can, even if along the way you might go, oh, that's uncomfortable, or that's not really me, you figure it out. So I think that's one that was helpful. As far as how one I challenged and maybe didn't walk away too far away from, actually, like they ended up having to come back to, is actually the same one. So even though I think you can learn anything, and I think along the way in this journey, I did everything from create content and think about policy and learn about economics and all these other things that I'm interested in, or but I'm not an expert on. It is interesting that I've still had technology and engineering be a pretty consistent through line all the way through. And I think it's a reminder that while it's worth challenging and pushing and expanding your sense of identity and what you can learn, it doesn't mean that it's completely made up either. Like you do develop, you do have interests, you do have preferences, you do have skills. And so it's good to push it, but you do sometimes kind of come back to where you started, and that's okay too.
Yeah, that the point that you make there of challenging that assumption of not being able to just sort of learn anything you want reminds me of a Marcus Aurelius quote
Mm.
that something along the lines of, if it's humanly possible, then it's possible for me to do it. Um, and I think that fits in really well with obviously the startup mindset, which you've had extensive experience training in and being sort of immersed in. Um, were there any particular skills from that period that you found that were just invaluable for bringing into this research and this evaluation of where you wanted to take your career?
Yes, I think I'll talk about two. Um, I think the first one, which I couldn't recommend more highly, and I still see very few people take full advantage of, is talking to people, like reaching out to people, asking them questions. Yeah, that's it. Like bringing people into your journey in all the ways. I think people have this sense that they have to bring value to a conversation, or that they can only talk to certain types of people after they've earned it. But the number of times that I have gotten on phone calls or emails, or otherwise been supported by Fortune 500 type executives, people who are at the peak of their career in academia or in industry or in government, and they've been willing to pick up the phone either to help me and advise me, because that can be really fulfilling for these people all on its own, or to recognize that, hey, maybe this is a young person or an early career person, but maybe if they're if they really want something, then me helping them now can this person can add to my ecosystem as well. So people recognize that on both sides. So I'm constantly reaching out to people way above my pay grade, as that expression goes, and getting responses back. And I think the people who do this have disproportionate success. So I always recommend learning from others. So that's a big one.
What have you found to be the best way to approach reaching out in that sort of cold way to people who you don't have any connections with?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is kind of like a know your audience sort of answer. So work backwards, right? Like who are they, and like what would they care about, or what's some things that they're involved in. So first thing is, I would actually say uh, you probably have people in your existing network that can help you already, right? Like if you're anywhere close to the domain, or even if you're not, it's very doable to bootstrap new networks of people. So that could be like someone in your friend network, someone in your family network, someone in your LinkedIn network, someone in your Twitter network. Um, Finding those kind of mutual connections, and things like LinkedIn have made this very easy now, can be a great way to find the first people. If someone is a completely disconnected person, the first thing is, I mean, cold emails, cold reach outs are fine. Whether that's a email or a LinkedIn connect, or walking up to them in an event or a conference. I find that events and conferences are places where people tend to be quite open to meeting people, so that's even better, as long as they're not the person getting flooded. So they may be right after they've given a talk. But in general, both warm connections and cold connections and simple cold reach outs can work. And then in terms of what goes in that content, it's about just working backwards. So for example, if you know that they have a big passion for education, maybe you can say to them, oh, and we can kind of share whatever we learned with a broader audience, or I'm a person who's learning. Would you be willing to be able to helpful? Or if you know that they're looking to hire people, maybe you can say, oh, and I'd love to hear more about your open roles. Like essentially just kind of work backwards from who they are and what they care about, to see what you can provide, but also to kind of fit into their ways of working and communicating as well.
That makes a lot of sense. How did you really leverage this during that period of independent research?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many people I spoke to during the food sustainability research, but it would be easily on the order of many dozens, and maybe even more than that if you include things like events. But I was reaching out to friends, family, friends of friends, family of family, um, connections or like cold reach outs events constantly to say, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? Or here's one question that's on my mind. What do you think? Or here's kind of what I'm trying to achieve. What would you do in my position? And I want to be clear, that was in my discovery phase, but not just in my discovery phase, even at Vow. Me and the founders and a few others in the organization use this to great effect constantly. We would say, hey, we're an up and coming startup doing this. Can you help me with manufacturing? And and also this is an interesting thing. The more positive and impactful and ambitious the thing you're working on, the more people want to help. So yeah, I mean, I guess the simple answer to your question is I asked lots of people lots of questions and looked for ways that I could support them at different points in that journey as well.
Yeah, awesome. It kind of loops back to how we got connected, because it was through one of those questions that you just chucked up on LinkedIn of, I think you're asking about people who had started organizations remotely, which is how we started High Impact Engineers. And I sent you a message with some of the things that that we'd sort of learnt and discovered along the way. And here we are recording a podcast episode together now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one important thing is, offering to support where you can, up to within reasonable bounds. But I think at the end of that message, I was something like, "Hey, Sean, and how can I help you?" And I think things like maybe this podcast episode came up organically in a few of those later conversations.
Yeah, for sure. So we sort of discussed a little bit of around your mindset heading into this period of independent research. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about some of the activities that you undertook and sort of how. I'm curious how you sort of structured this process, because it was about a year long, right?
Yeah, all in all, it was about a year and change, something like that.
Yeah. And did you have a really strong or clear plan going in, or was it a bit more sort of organic?
Very organic, very much
Yeah.
organic. I often have like a loose goal or a loose plan, but I'm constantly kind of iterating on that. And yeah, I'll give the various stages and some major actions. I won't try and cover everything because obviously that would take up a lot of time. But at the very early stage, let's even say before when I joined Plaid, I wanted to grow my skills and be exposed to the world. Eventually, I realized, oh, the specific problems I'm being exposed to here aren't the ones I want to work on. So I left Plaid knowing that I wasn't going to find that there. In terms of like how I achieved that, I had savings. I also went and lived in low cost locales and did some traveling at the same time as doing the research, things that kind of make that whole process easier. And then I started looking at things I was kind of interested in or wanted to learn anyway, as a way to be exposed to more problems. And that involved reading or doing some hobby projects, things like that. And then I found food sustainability, like I said earlier, through my friend who worked at the Good Food Institute. And once I found that and thought it was interesting, and it was at the time one of many, but it was, the one that was getting more interesting, I just read a lot of things, watched a lot of things, asked a lot of people a lot of questions. And this part is really important. I did both consuming things, but also synthesizing things. And it took me a little while to figure that out. It's like, it's very easy in today's day and age to find information. So consumption was really easy. Synthesis is harder. And for synthesis, I would do things like maybe I would say, oh, here's a little project I could do. Like maybe I could like call this, talk to this old entrepreneur and offer to help, do some interviews for them. That's an example of a project. Another would be, let's just write some things. Let's write a blog post on what I've learned. Anything to take things from like purely like an input to some sort of output can be really valuable in helping you process and develop original and creative and more action oriented outcomes. So, and then I just did that again and again and again for a while. And what that looked like was things like, I would work on a farm for a little while and learn something and then produce a blog post or think about a new startup idea with it. I would do a little project with another entrepreneur or a company or a consulting, and I would turn that into a little project. So I did that again and again and again and again. And near the end, I had some startup ideas that maybe could have turned into kind of proper businesses. And I did actually, near the end, actually start a formal consulting business as a way to be exposed to more ideas. And I was going to turn that into a product idea. But by the end, I was exposed to one specific company, Vow, which seemed to be kind of working on the same mission and goal that I wanted to work on, that I aligned with strongly on a values basis and felt that I could add a lot to. So essentially, one of these iterations led to a more permanent or full-time sort of opportunity, which turned out for me to be that the head of engineering at Val.
Fantastic. One of the things I found interesting about is sort of the results of your research was that you actually published this Airtable spreadsheet of future of food ideas, which I'll put a link in the show notes for. You've got in there, you sort of split up some of the results of your research by theme, and then some sort of business or product ideas around each of those themes. So themes including sort of agrobotics and automation, cellular agriculture, plant-based foods, and ideas around cell counting, structured meat cells, replacing expensive software, things of that nature. This seems like something you could have done and sort of kept guarded to yourself or shared with a select group of friends. What was your idea behind making it public?
Yeah, I think it's a really good call out, and you are reminding me, Sean, of one very important piece related to this, particularly. Well, I was going to say particularly in the startup world, but I don't think that's true. I think it's true in general. I think um, showing your work, working in public, can be a really big amplifier on any kind of these discovery processes. So if you don't do that, I mean, it's going to sound obvious in hindsight, but then actually watch people's actions and how they work, and you often see how rare this actually is in practice. Um, but, if you work on a project but never tell anybody about it, you will have learned something, but you definitely aren't getting, external feedback. You're not really giving the opportunity for others to find you and maybe want to work with you or hire you or invest in you or mentor you or any of those things. And you're not giving the chance for those ideas to maybe, get new ideas built on them by other people either. So, but if you do, if you publish, whether it be as a podcast, as a blog post, as by talking about it with every single person you meet, by not keeping these things secret, all of a sudden, all the things we just talked about become possible. You have people wanting to invest in you, mentor you, support you, hire you, and show your work, know your work. And that's an incredibly powerful amplifier. So I think you're absolutely right. That's a really big, important aspect of the type of discovery work that I like to do.
Mm. Yeah, for me, I find the sharing part difficult.
Mm.
I find like the actual putting it out there in the world, and even if there's a low chance that anyone's actually going to look at it,
Mm-hmm.
that still seems really daunting. Did you have the same sort of feeling when you started doing this?
I mean, the answer is definitely yes to a degree. I'll give you a concrete example. I put out today, just today, like literally like 2 hours ago, some predictions around AI. And of course, to make those predictions really robust, you would need like pages and pages and pages of some report, which by the way, people would still criticize. But if you have pages and pages, at least you say there's rigor behind it, right? But to do that, I would have had to put in like 100 times the work to make it externally polished, and therefore I wouldn't have done it, or I would have done it 1/100th of the amount of times that I'm doing with this. Instead, I just put this table out there and said, hey, if you want to learn more, listen to this podcast, follow me here and here, that sort of thing. And one of the first messages I got, or like one of the comments on there, was something like this thing has no value. There's no, I can't remember what it said, like no depth, no value, something like that. And it hurts. Like it really does hurt. But I think I think it's just, yeah, this is the managing your psychology piece, right? It's like, there's also a lot of people who like and comment and say good things as well, but we have a natural human bias to overemphasize the negative things. So I think this is just where things like, learning about your cognitive biases, like doing a lot of self work, to understand your own failure modes, finding those positive channels to share. And if you have more high quality positive channels at first, the practice really is important. So, yeah, the short answer is yes, it is hard, but there is stuff you can do to get better at this. And I haven't read the book, but there's literally a book called Show Your Work, I believe, on this exact topic. I know that there's another book which I haven't read but comes highly recommended called The Artist's Way that people enjoy for this sort of question. So the long story is this takes practice, this takes growth, but it is something everybody can do and improve on.
That makes sense. Is there anything from the work you were shown during that period, or just the way you sort of went about it, that you've changed now coming into your sort of more recent pivot towards AI safety and AI alignment?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing I definitely noticed with this time doing the AI alignment that is that it's happened a lot faster. And some of that I think I can just put down to I had more of a concrete idea of what I wanted to do before I started versus the last time. But I think a lot of it is just these things feel more natural to me, right? Like creating the podcast, sharing things publicly, um, knowing when to reach out and who to reach out to and how to reach out. They practice makes perfect. So I think it's gotten better. I think in terms of concrete things, I mean, concrete things like, for example, when it comes to showing your work, really finding what works for you. So, for example, writing is something I've always wanted to do more of, and I have done some of. Like you can see it, my writings on the internet, but I have never come close to being as prolific as some writers on the internet. And yet, as I've pivoted into this podcast, I've had all of a sudden like a few hundred subscribers in a short amount of time and a few thousand listens. And it's just because I realized conversation is a lot more energizing and organic to me than writing is. So I think that's about figuring out what works for you and doubling down on that. I think that's really important to know that not everything that works for others will work for you, but finding those avenues of connecting with others and sharing your work is really important still.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's challenging because it's one of those things that you just need to do to find out. And I think when the nice thing about having the ambition to affect really significant positive change in the world is that if that's your true goal, you can kind of justify spending a bit of time making some mistakes and trying to figure out the best way to go about things. Because as as bad as the world may seem in some aspects, your your ability to actually affect change will only grow over time. And being patient about that and not expecting something to happen straight away uh, seems like a very important mindset to bring into it, because it allows you to have that patience to make mistakes and try things and figure out what works for you and what doesn't, and what resonates well with others, and how you can sort of build out your network and show your work in the best and most effective way possible to affect that change.
Yeah. And I think speaking of managing your psychology and especially people in their early career, but I think at all points this is true. We're so taught in the school and university system not to fail, right? And we start to optimize for not failing. But you know, most of the things I do are failures. No one knows them, or they're forgotten very quickly. People only remember the companies and the organizations and the initiatives that have had, or the posts that anybody actually engaged with. So I think anything you can do to recognize that not just making mistakes, but putting stuff out there and having that not catch, not be successful, or someone giving you criticism is actually okay and can lead to bigger and better things, is a really big idea. And it's one that even, for example, at Val, for example, we literally have brought this into a company value. So it's not just at the startup stage, but even at the growth stages. Like we call it blow up the bioreactor. How much time do you plan? Do you spend just planning to kind of get it right the first time versus just putting something out there that's 80% good, 80/20, so 20% of the work, but 80% of the good, like reasonable idea, and then learning from it. And I think embracing failure is a big reason why I've been able to enter new spaces and find new opportunities. Is just because I learned at an early stage that failure was okay. And like I said, my first company, I say moderate success, but it felt like a total failure at the time. So that was, I had to go through that at an early stage. So embracing failure seems to be quite an important skill as well.
Yeah, I love blowing up the bioreactor as a company value.
Yeah.
I think I came across it maybe like 6 months or so ago when I was scrolling through Val's open opportunities, and yeah, just a fantastic one.
Yeah,
Is
and
there
we
any?
took that, by the way, from SpaceX because of the blow up the rocket, and SpaceX has been able to also break through one of the what was seen to be one of the like hardest challenges of industry and government by lowering the cost of getting into space by orders of magnitude through the same methodology.
Yeah, it strikes me as something that's quite interesting to consider around how the role that industry plays in innovation for some really large scale changes. So you mentioned before just how big the food system is. Like the scale of it is massive. It's so integrated across so many different aspects of society, just on a logistical level, but also on like a beliefs and culture and what do you go and cook on the barbecue on the weekend type way. And it's such a large system to try and affect change in, but you can't necessarily rely on governments maybe to bring about that innovation or academia. So is there a particular way you think about where industry plays a role?
Yeah, I think I would actually, I would say all of these parts have a role to play. It's not, if you look at any significant change in the last several decades, like all of those players have had an impact. How government policy and funding affects things, how academic research and discoveries affect things, how industry can affect things. So they all have a role to play. I don't necessarily think they all have the same impact per dollar or per time. Um, I would argue that governments, as we understand them today, like especially the kind of the democratic, well-governed ones, like you find in places like Scandinavia and Australia, um, tend to be the best we've come up with, but still pretty cruddy in a lot of ways, right? Like simply speaking, like you go into governments and you watch things and you're like, wow, that's a lot of waste everywhere. Um, and just speaking frankly, like universities and academic institutions are pretty similar. Their problems are more around like poorly designed incentives and bureaucracy. Not for profits probably sit somewhere in between that world and industry, and it's because they kind of are a hybrid. Like they're private organizations, but they often gather their funding or license to operate from research institutions and governments as well. So and things like that. So um, everybody has a role to play, but it's not always going to be equal for a particular goal or impact. Personally, I've found that uh, industry can get a lot done. I mean, if you have to realize most of the world works in private organizations. Most of the world's economic or like the way people kind of spend most of their time, like the time that they work to kind of contribute to society, happens through their work, which mostly happens through private organizations. And then specifically, I think technology and change tends to be a big amplifier of impact, because it kind of, it's not like people are already doing the best they can with what they have, but if you bring something new in, like a new way of doing things or a new technology, we can go to another big step forward. And that's why I think technology and technology startups in particular tend to have a disproportionate impact per person per unit time. But it's not to say that the rest of the world and the rest of the economy doesn't have a lot of influence and impact as well.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I've noticed or was exposed to through charity entrepreneurship, who's a organization whose goal is to incubate really highly impactful nonprofits. One of their sort of ways that they describe nonprofits, or these types of nonprofits having a huge impact, is getting to the point where they are sort of the industry leading example of the best way to go about affecting change. And so they actually inspire other organizations to sort of raise up to that level of effectiveness, or governments to take over the program and sort of scale it up from what may be a really small scale thing to really a national level or international level program. Um, it strikes me that alternate protein may have some of that characteristics, where if certain organizations can push it to a level where it's just, best in class across, any protein source in terms of environmental sustainability, animal welfare, and just, a bunch of other things, as you mentioned, then yeah, everyone else sort of has to, that's the bar that others have to meet within the food system.
Yeah, and I think alternative protein is a good space as far as looking at how all three, of these areas have really been important, and also how organizations can be very effective regardless of whether they're industry or not. So, the Good Food Institute, this is like world class from everything I can see, and I've interacted with a lot of their people, but they're just as competent as any private organization anywhere in terms of the quality of the work and good use of resources that I've seen. So, um, shows how they can be successful. Um, there's another organization, New Harvest, which has also been very well run and done a lot of good work, but you start to see one of the other challenges in not-for-profits, which is funding, right? Like, so how do you sustain a not-for-profit? How do you, and they've struggled more with that. Thankfully, Good Food Institute hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, but it's an ongoing fight to always have that funding source. Um, but yes, and if you look even beyond not-for-profits, you see, for example, like the government of Singapore, with some of their strategy around um, the future of food and things like providing really, really sensible regulation. They've been absolutely crucial to the alternative protein space. If Singapore wasn't there, and maybe a couple of other countries of a similar thinking, there would be no cultured meat space. So yeah, there are definitely places within all parts of society that can contribute, just as long as you make sure that you're actually in one of those places that's really high quality, and you're actually having impact, which not every organization does.
Mm. While we're on the topic, where do you see engineers fitting into the alternate protein space?
Yeah, sure. So specific alternative protein, I mean, the short version is there's a lot of ways you can contribute. So it's not, you're not short on options. So alternative protein is a big term that says anything that's a pretty much a new protein source that's better than what's come before. So they tend to be, the big categories are plant-based sources, things like Beyond Meat, which is using pea protein to create, that kind of meaty texture. Um, Others are like cultured meat, so things like VOW. So we're trying to grow meat from cells, so to kind of resemble the same tissue that you get out of regular animal meat. Um, and then the third category, the major category, is around precision fermentation, or using um, engineered yeast and bacteria to produce specific food compounds. So, for example, Perfect Day is doing this to make dairy replacements. So, in all of these companies, there's a lot of engineering to be done. Everything from at the research phase, applying um, hardware, software, chemical, process engineering, food engineering to kind of develop these products, then to scale them up. So that involves everything from kind of tracking and tracing in software and hardware systems through to the actual physical manufacture, which is obviously a lot of mechanical, to building the plants, which is civil, um, through to now distribution, cold chain, novel ways of customers buying this stuff. There's a lot of designing and building throughout that entire process. So it is a massive world of engineering out there, and there's a lot of engineers hired by all of these companies.
Interesting. What are some of the difficulties you faced in trying to find engineers to work at Val?
Mm. So I think there are a lot of really high quality early career folks, so people who've just come out of university. I think most people coming out of university, of course, they're going to be lacking in certain skills that you just need to be doing the job. So as long as they've done some real engineering outside, textbooks, they've done a solar car project or they've done an internship or something, they've learned some good skills. And that I think on that end of town, there's a lot of good people, and it's just about us kind of picking the most promising candidates and continuing to expand the pool that we can hire from there. So that's been not too bad. I think we've had more of a challenge around middle and late career folks, and it's because that Australia has historically not had a particularly thriving startup space. And so a lot of the mid to late career folks that we've seen tend to be have less urgency, um, bias towards perfectionism instead of that kind of blow up the bioreactor type mentality, tend to focus on um, kind of really excessively communicating and trying to like cover every angle in their comms rather than again just like building the thing and trying it. Um, these kinds of challenges have been real issues for us, and so we've had to either retrain people kind of quite a bit or hire from startups, a small startup pool in Sydney, or hire from overseas, or help train up more junior engineers to kind of play these roles. So it's a cultural and management and communication style gap that we see in that mid to late career engineers right now is the biggest issue.
Mm. What is that sort of for the category of mid-career people who you're bringing on board and trying to retrain?
Yep.
What does that sort of look like? And is there anything that people who are in that position who want to transition into a more higher impact role, but maybe feel like they sort of fit that description of one of the challenging sort of aspects of mid-career people that you found? What can they sort of be doing before they make that transition to sort of help correct or I guess set themselves up for success in making such a transition?
Yeah, I think yeah, so I talked a lot about kind of maybe the way they communicate and work. I think one other thing I'll say is larger companies often specialize people quite a bit, and that means they lose their broader set of technical and non-technical skills. And both those things are quite important, and they're intertwined as well. Often, sometimes people are communicating a lot because they don't know how to do something, and they're looking to get resources to do the thing. So I think the advice is actually pretty simple. It's like go back to the basics, like go back to like the way you worked when you were at home doing a home project or at uni doing a project where you didn't have just the ability to call on like all kinds of resources. The more you can just do quickly and ably yourself or with like the people and tools within reach, the more impactful you'll be, and therefore the more these companies will want you. Because what's going to happen if you have that skill set is you're going to walk in, you're going to see a bunch of problems, and instead of asking for permission, instead of asking for resources, instead of trying to convince people, you'll just jump in and solve the problems. And once you're solving problems, these companies just you're an ideal person for them, because why would they let go of someone who, or not invest in the person who's just solving all their problems? So I think go back to the basics of of real engineering, moving quickly, and having a broader set of understanding of the problems in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like something that in principle sounds pretty straightforward to do. I think in practice it might seem daunting, but I think there are like certainly I'm sure in the startup space there would be companies that you could reach out to and just ask, hey, can I do some of like can I interview some people for you as you mentioned earlier, or just nonprofits as well are always looking for help and always have tons of problems, and so you could do a bit of volunteering, just take on side projects, side research
Yeah, or
sort
even
of based
just hobby
projects.
projects, like like let's say for example, it obviously depends on the discipline, but let's say for example we're talking about um, a mechanical engineer. Like if you've narrowed yourself to, I know how to do, let's say, this specific type of finite element analysis, and I am one person in a long chain, that's not going to work for a startup. That's not going to work for Val. So instead, be like, well, what's something I could build at home? Like what? Uh, maybe I would, one project that I've always said I would do and haven't done, so I'll just give it away. And if someone builds it, and ships it to my house, I'll be really happy. Like make the blinds go up,
Hmm.
in the morning to wake up to natural sunlight. Like it's not complicated, but it'll force you to like pick up a microcontroller, like write some code, do some 3D printing or some other sort of rapid prototyping. Like just go through the full life cycle of any project. And you'll be surprised how quickly you'll find that you'll need to update your skills. You'll need to um, learn things and combine things and integrate things and test things. And that's exactly what we're looking for and often missing in our people, both in the interview process but also on the job.
Yeah, one of my PhD colleagues was trying to do that exact same thing for his partner, figure out how to open the blinds. I seem to recall him finding it actually not that trivial, and it's quite hard to find a motor that is a reasonable size that you can mount in a way to do that. Um, yeah, I personally love doing those sorts of home projects. Like I set up, I just had an Arduino and a temperature sensor. I set that up, and along with a Raspberry Pi to act as a home server. And you know that's actually turned out to be a really useful system for me because now I can use it as a VPN. I can connect whatever sensor I want to it and like visualize it on a dashboard. And it was just something fun that I was able to do in my free time to kind of help me through COVID.
100%. No. Yeah, these things don't have to be complicated. I think they should be, they're the kind of things that hopefully got you into engineering in the first place. But I think a lot of Aussie companies and large companies everywhere in the world um, have pushed too many engineers to just be pure managers and pure communicators. And that's important. We care about communication and people skills, but we don't hire engineering managers purely for their communication and people skills. We're also hiring them for their engineering skills and understanding of technology. So those things seem to be the lacking piece in a lot of the mid-career people we look at.
Mm. It strikes me that you've been able to keep that spark of like remembering why you wanted to become an engineer
Mm.
uh, and that sort of tinkering and hacking and blowing up the bioreactor mindset. It seems to be something that you've carried throughout your career so far.
I think so. I mean, like, I don't give myself like a 10 out of 10 on this metric, to be very clear. I know people who've done a better job than I have at doing more of that tinkering more often. Um, so I don't give myself a 10 out of 10, but I think I've been more cognizant of it and probably more forced to do it by being always going back to that kind of early stage sort of operation where there is nobody else to do it, or so that sort of thing. So I yes, I value it. I think I can always be better at it as well. So I definitely don't think I think there's a lot of room for improvement for me as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, yeah, you don't want to rest on your laurels on something like that because that's when you start falling behind on it.
Yep, definitely.
Uh, Speaking of your sort of career to date, what has been the sort of the North Star that's guided your decision making process? Is there something consistent across your whole career, or has it been something that you've reevaluated along the way?
Definitely things have evolved, but I'll just state two that I think have certainly stood the test of time for a while. I think the first is learning and maximizing your learning. I think it is very easy to fall into I already know a lot of things and therefore let's stop learning. And then whenever I feel that I'm not learning a lot every day, I've actually got a little habit tracker, and on there it says learn something new, and I'm happy to report that I tick that box every day with at least something, even one thing, right? But
What was
just
today's thing?
I haven't done the habit for today,
Ah,
so we'll see. But I've definitely no, I've learned some things today. So yeah, so I think the point is like keeping that like learning rate high is a really important metric and goal. And then the other one is for me, it's about impact, which is about um, giving back to the world in some way, and really think about how you can do not necessarily maybe the maximum of that, because I think that can be taking you in the weird directions as well, but at least giving back in a big way every day or close to. Not getting just too self-centered or short-sighted, because one, that's not going to make you quite fulfilled, and also actually you miss things. Like often a lot of the things I've done, I've not at all thought about, is it a valuable company, like in terms of like the financial side. But if you just are doing valuable things for the world, it's usually pretty easy to then say, how do I charge for this or turn this into a product? Like you start from like what value are you adding first, and then think about monetization rather than the other way around. And I think, yeah, so impact, the value you create, that's another big thing I try to keep an eye on.
hmm. And what have you learned about your personal capacity for having impact over the course of your career?
I think I've learned that individuals can do a lot. I think sometimes we underestimate our own ability to do things, so that's important to know. Um, but they do a lot with others, right? So an individual's like being there, not being there can make a big difference, but they don't do it as an island. They do it with other people supporting them, being peers to them, being leaders to them, themselves being leaders to others, all of these different combinations. Um, and then I guess the last thing, which is a little bit counter or different to what I've just said, is actually also recognizing that you can't solve everything, right? Like I have now, because I have honed myself to find problems, I do see a lot of things, a lot of problems too. And I walk through and I'm like, oh, that could be better. Like housing in Sydney could be better, and like transport in Sydney could be better, and like, this economic system could be better, and oh, that like UI could be better. I see it all the time now. But I've also recognized that, sometimes you can comment on that or share ideas with the world or encourage others to work on it. So there's nothing, not saying you couldn't contribute, but as far as your kind of your big impacts, they do tend to get concentrated at least for a period of time. So recognizing like what you're going to work on, and putting quite a bit of effort behind that thing, and then being okay with the other things just going their due course is quite an important thing as well, I think.
So I think that leads in nicely to asking about what you're currently working on now and how you sort of came to prioritize that over solving Sydney's housing crisis and transportation problems
and climate change and food
and
sustainability
climate change.
obviously had
Yeah.
a lot more momentum behind. Yeah, look, I mean, I just want to start by saying a couple of things. One is I think Vow is an incredible place to be, and for anyone listening who's thinking about maybe joining Vow, go do it. It's an incredible place. You will learn a lot and have a lot of impact. Um, so it was a hard decision to walk away, in any capacity. I'm on sabbatical from Vow, and I could go back, but it's less likely. Um, so it was a hard decision to walk away. Um, The reason I did it in this case was actually just because I found another problem that I thought was so big, and when I dug into it, I just didn't see the amount of work or the type of work on it that I thought it deserved. Um, which is around this question of AI safety. So, for anybody listening who's kind of curious about this stuff, so we have artificial intelligence today, right? We have systems that can identify objects and create speech and understand speech, and on many of those narrow things, they're already superhuman. They're far above human levels. And when we think about what makes humans special, in terms of our capabilities, not in terms of things like our values, but in terms of our capabilities, it's because we have general intelligence. We have the ability to see a new problem, a new situation, and quickly adapt ourselves to that. If Sean said to me, Soroush, jump up and twirl, I may have never done the specific twirl. This will be a comedic value to the audience. I've never done the twirl that he said, but I can do something like it. And if he asked me to do it, showed me a video and asked me to copy it, I could do it, eventually. So that's really a special thing. Animals have it to a degree, humans have it to a greater degree, and machines really don't have it at all. Most machines are very dumb in that regard. But the human brain is made of atoms, and uh, there's nothing that says that we can't create general intelligence in other substrates in other ways. And for all the people who've spent a long time thinking about this, they're well on their way. There's a lot of good research that says this is possible and this can be done. And what people have realized with things like ChatGPT is that it's not only possible, but actually like things that seemed impossible are getting easier and easier by the day. So essentially, without going into all the details, I think it is possible that we will get general intelligence in machines in this century, most likely in my lifetime. And if that's the case, I think it's going to be probably the biggest inflection points since either maybe the Enlightenment or maybe since humans, started being modern humans. So that's a really big inflection point. And there is some thinking and some talking on this on both the opportunities but also the risks and challenges, but not as much as I would expect for just how important it is. And so after a bit of time of kind of digging into this, talking to people and recognizing there was a gap, I decided it was time to kind of work on it. And I think the most likely outcome will be the most kind of like the thing that I'm leaning towards at the moment is starting a new organization around kind of the beneficial development of probably a new startup. Um, so yeah, if anybody out there is listening and is interested in this stuff or is already working on this stuff and wants to talk, please reach out as well.
Yeah, sure. And we'll put some ways to contact you in the show notes. What was the straw that broke the camel's back in making you want to make this change or take the sabbatical and actually commit full-time effort onto this endeavor?
I think at first I wanted to understand how important this was, whether um, it had real legs, and that was just things like reading and talking to experts, and that was good. And then it was about making sure I wasn't just jumping to the shiny thing, rather than it takes time to have impact, and I would rather have stayed in at Vow and extended my expertise in that world, except for the fact that I really do think this is a really big challenge. So understanding my own motivations and making sure that they were sustained and long term. And then and then I tried to do it on the side of Val for a while. So I tried to do it kind of as a side project, found that it was too deep and fast moving to do that. So I kind of had only two choices, which is to say, I won't work on this and I'll leave this to others, or I and keep working on what I'm doing here at Val, or I will jump. And I decided that in terms of both what impact I thought I could have and how important the problem was, this was the right decision for me.
How important do you feel it is for you to develop your own perspective on a cause? It seems to me a trend between the process you took to arrive at alternate proteins as the thing that you wanted to do, and now again with AI safety and AI alignment. So for you, how do you think about developing your understanding of a topic before you commit to it?
I think it's very important. At the end of the day, if you don't have that, if you're only kind of jumping onto other people's bandwagons, what the problem is a couple things. One, that like you're putting your life in somebody else's as far as their judgment. So one, you better hope that they really know their stuff. Um, Two, I mean, I guess they have different values and preferences and views of the world, so it may not be perfectly aligned with that person. And the third thing is that lack of depth of what I call conviction in the problem. Like if it's not yours, but you're actually borrowing from somebody else, then it may not be sustained. For example, right now, for example, AI is quite a hot topic, right? But let's be honest, like it's going to have other troughs, right? Like maybe in like 2 years, people find out that actually ChatGPT is kind of plateaued and it's going to take a long time to like get the next breakthrough, and all the interest is just going to evaporate. If I don't have my own conviction and excitement for it, then 2 years from now I'll be very low on motivation, and I would have probably got a lot less done than if it was my own conviction. So I think developing conviction is important for sustaining your own motivation towards a problem as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I found a similar thing throughout the course of my PhD of particularly given that it coincided with the pandemic, there was obviously some lows there of really having to think about, wait, why am I doing this? Like, what was my reason again? And for me, I had a clear reason and conviction going in. Like it was something that I wanted to do because in 5-10 years time, I thought it would enable me to work on things that I'd want to be able to work on, and that really helped me come through the troughs of that experience and that undertaking, because these things can just take time. You've spent 3 to 4 years now working on alternate proteins, and I imagine without conviction around why that was something important for you to switch to working on, that would have been either a really rough 3 to 4 years, or it just wouldn't have been that long.
I agree. I agree. Yep. Yeah, and then the last question, reason for developing your own understanding and depth of understanding is also just from the point of view of contribution. Like, it's hard to come up with original insights and contributions if all you're doing is regurgitating what somebody else is saying. So, even from the point of view of just being good at what you do, it's good to develop a good, deep understanding.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, return to, touch on?
I think the only thing is something I see again and again is um, whatever whatever limitations you're setting yourself now, whoever is listening to this is say thinking to themselves, I am this and I'm not this, or I can do this and I can't do this. Know that those are not laws of the universe, right? Like they are within your power to shape and change. And I'm not saying, everybody can do everything. That's not, that's the other extreme. But I think it's good to keep questioning and challenging and growing. Always, if you're always learning, if you're, there was a really, really good blog post. It was like a GitHub post I saw from a Stanford professor, I think, where the core line was, the slope is more important than the intercept. The slope is more important than the intercept. So like focus on the slope. Like it doesn't matter if you're starting behind somebody else or starting in a new area. If you're learning and growing and believe that you can learn and grow, that slope can go on for a very long time. And you might be surprised how quickly you can get to the frontier of any new field or endeavor. So don't hold yourself back is all I would say.
Terrific. What do you wish you had invented, and why?
Oh wow. What I wish I had invented. It's a big one. It's a really good question, but it's really hard to answer as well. It's a really hard one. Okay, I'll just give the first one that's come to mind, which is totally like honestly like an almost impossible invention. But I'm reading Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch right now, and he talks a lot about this idea that um, the Enlightenment was a really special time because we started to recognize that breaking out of norms and um, questioning things and criticizing things was actually a good activity, that it wasn't like a bad activity. And I would count that whoever the early people who made those claims and started living it in a culture and a society and a species that had never done that, really must have changed things because there's a noticeable uptick in history. So I guess I'm going to go with the culture of criticism. I wish I had invented the culture of criticism and the Enlightenment.
That's awesome. If you didn't invent it, you've definitely employed it very well to challenge your own assumptions and figure out how you can use your career to do a lot of good in the world. So that seems like a perfect invention for you to have picked.
I appreciate it. I'm a child of the Enlightenment.
Terrific. Well, before we finish up, where can people find you online, and is there anything you'd like to plug?
Yeah. Yes. If you're a physical engineer and you're living in Sydney, I would definitely go check out, or living in Sydney or excited about moving to Sydney, check out Val. It's an incredible company working on the future of food and ending industrial animal agriculture. If you're interested in artificial intelligence and its kind of future implications, then please follow me on the AGI Show podcast, so www.theagishow.com, as well as LinkedIn and Twitter. And yeah, we'll stop there for now. I'll plug those two things.
Awesome. Well, Soroush, thank you very much for joining me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for the great questions.
You're welcome. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Soroush. For detailed show notes and valuable resources related to this episode, head to engineeredforimpact.show/Soroush. That's SOROUSH. You can support Engineered for Impact by leaving us a review on your preferred podcasting platform, dropping us a comment on the YouTube video for this episode, or heading to engineeredforimpact.show and leaving us anonymous feedback. You can also support the show financially. Engineered for Impact is brought to you by our foundation, High Impact Engineers, which is organized in the USA. You can head to engineeredforimpact.show to